Court records describe what happened in that Missouri farmhouse on December 16, 2004, in details so precise and so disturbing that the investigators who first read them requested reassignment. A pregnant woman was strangled in her own home. Her baby was cut from her body with a kitchen knife. And the woman who did it drove home with the infant, called her husband, and told him she had just given birth. That woman, Lisa Montgomery, would become the first female inmate executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. But she was not the last woman in this country to sit on death row for a crime that defied every framework investigators had for understanding human cruelty. Right now, in prisons across the United States, 7 women await execution for crimes that court records describe in terms usually reserved for the most extreme cases in modern American criminal history. What the documented evidence shows about how these women lived, what they did, and what has happened to them since their convictions is something most people who follow true crime have never fully heard in one place. One of them tortured a teenage girl for 30 minutes before beating her to death with a piece of asphalt. One of them, dressed as a law enforcement officer, walked into a family home and shot a 9-year-old girl in the face at point-blank range. But what the trial records reveal about the weeks and months that led to those moments, the planning, the patterns, the documented psychological histories, is where this story becomes something far more disturbing than the crimes themselves. And there is one detail buried in the appellate records of one of these cases that investigators have described, on the record, as the most difficult thing they encountered in their entire careers. That detail will surface before this documentary is over. You might think that the women who end up on death row are defined entirely by a single moment of violence. One decision, one night, one irreversible act. But according to the trial records, the pre-sentencing evaluations, and the documented behavioral histories compiled across these 7 cases, what emerges is a pattern. Not of randomness, not of impulse alone, but of escalation, of planning, and in several of these cases, of a calculated coldness that prosecutors described in open court as unlike anything they had prosecuted before. This is the documented story of 7 women on death row in the United States. Their crimes, their trials, their lives inside the facilities that now hold them, and in at least one case, the execution that ended it. Nothing in what follows is invented. Every scene, every detail, every moment of horror described in this documentary traces directly to court records, verified testimony, investigative journalism, or official government documentation.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
There are cases that change the people who work them. Not because investigators are unfamiliar with violence. Not because they lack the professional distance that years in law enforcement is supposed to build. But because some crimes arrive with a specific combination of premeditation, intimacy, and cruelty that the human mind, even a trained one, was not designed to process without cost. The case of Lisa Montgomery was one of those cases. What the federal court records document about the night of December 16, 2004, and about the years of planning that preceded it, is something that prosecutors, investigators, and appellate judges have returned to repeatedly in the 2 decades since it happened. Not because the facts were ever in dispute, but because the facts, taken together, represent something that the American criminal justice system has rarely been asked to hold. To understand what Lisa Montgomery did and why she did it, the documented record makes clear that you have to understand who she was long before that night in Missouri. And who she was, according to court records, psychological evaluations, and testimony from people who knew her across multiple decades, was a person who had been failed at every level, in every direction from the very beginning. Lisa Montgomery was born on February 27, 1968, in Omaha, Nebraska. Her childhood, as documented in the extensive mitigation evidence compiled for her federal trial, was not simply difficult. It was, according to the forensic psychologists who evaluated her and the witnesses who testified under oath, a sustained and systematic destruction of a child. Her mother, Judy Shaughnessy, was an alcoholic whose behavior toward Lisa was documented as erratic, volatile, and at times physically brutal. The home Lisa grew up and moved frequently was consistently chaotic, and provided none of the stability that child development research identifies as foundational to psychological health. But the abuse that would define Lisa Montgomery's psychological history went far beyond what her mother inflicted. Court records and mitigation testimony document that Lisa was sexually abused from a very young age by multiple men in her household and in her extended environment. The abuse was not occasional. According to the forensic evidence presented at trial, it was chronic, it was severe, and it continued across years of her childhood and adolescence without intervention from any adult who was positioned to stop it. Her stepfather, Jack Kleiner, was identified in the mitigation record as a primary abuser. Witnesses testified that the abuse was known within the household and was not hidden. It was, according to testimony, treated as something close to normal within the environment Lisa grew up in. The psychological damage that resulted from this history was documented in clinical terms by multiple forensic experts who evaluated Lisa Montgomery in the years leading up to her execution. Diagnoses documented in the record included complex post-traumatic stress disorder, temporal lobe epilepsy resulting from head trauma sustained during abuse, and dissociative disorder. One forensic psychologist testified that Lisa Montgomery's neurological and psychological profile was among the most severely damaged they had encountered in decades of forensic evaluation work. None of this was presented as an excuse by the defense team that compiled it. It was presented as context, as the documented explanation for how a human being arrives at the place Lisa Montgomery arrived at on December 16, 2004. Lisa married young. Her first marriage to Carl Bowman produced 4 children. The marriage was described by those who knew the couple as unstable, and it ended in divorce. She remarried, this time to Kevin Montgomery, her stepbrother, and the couple settled in Melvern, Kansas, a small rural town in Osage County. By the early 2000s, Lisa Montgomery had constructed a particular identity for herself within the community around Melvern. She was known as a dog breeder. She was involved in rat terrier breeding circles, which brought her into contact with a network of people across the Midwest who shared that interest. And it was through that network that Lisa Montgomery encountered Bobby Joe Stinnett. Bobby Joe Stinnett was 23 years old. She lived in Skidmore, Missouri with her husband Zeb, and she was 8 months pregnant with their first child. She was also involved in the rat terrier breeding community, and she and Lisa Montgomery had been in contact online through message boards and email exchanges connected to that shared interest. Court records document that Lisa Montgomery had been telling people in her life, including her husband Kevin, that she was pregnant. She was not pregnant. What the investigation would later establish through digital forensic evidence is that the lie about the pregnancy had created a situation Lisa Montgomery apparently believed she needed to resolve. And the resolution she planned, according to the documented evidence, was to obtain a baby by taking one. The digital trail compiled by investigators was extensive. In the weeks before December 16, 2004, Lisa Montgomery had conducted internet searches on topics including cesarean delivery procedures, fetal development at 8 months, and how to perform an emergency delivery. She had exchanged messages with Bobby Joe Stinnett, arranging a visit to view a litter of rat terrier puppies. She drove from Kansas to Skidmore, Missouri, on the morning of December 16th. She arrived at the Stinnett home. And what happened inside that house over the next period of time is documented in the forensic and pathological evidence compiled for the federal trial in a level of detail that the judge presiding over the case described, on the record, as among the most difficult material he had encountered in his judicial career. Lisa Montgomery strangled Bobby Joe Stinnett with a rope she had brought with her. She then used a kitchen knife she had also brought with her to perform a crude cesarean incision on Bobby Joe's body. She removed the infant, a girl who survived, from the womb. She cleaned herself up using materials in the Stinnett home. She drove back to Kansas with the infant. She called her husband Kevin and told him she had given birth. She took the baby to a diner in Melvern the following morning and introduced her to people she knew there as her own newborn daughter. Zeb Stinnett returned home that evening to find his wife's body. He called 911. The investigation that followed moved quickly. Federal investigators with the FBI traced the digital communications between Lisa Montgomery and Bobby Joe Stinnett within hours. By the following morning, agents had identified Lisa Montgomery as the primary suspect. She was located at her home in Melvern, Kansas, still in possession of the infant. The baby, Victoria Joe Stinnett, was recovered alive and unharmed. She was returned to her father. Lisa Montgomery was arrested on December 17, 2004, less than 24 hours after the murder. The federal trial of Lisa Montgomery began in October 2007 in Kansas City, Missouri. The prosecution's case rested on the digital forensic evidence, the physical evidence recovered from the Stinnett home and from Lisa Montgomery's vehicle and residence, and the testimony of multiple witnesses including law enforcement, forensic experts, and people from both women's communities. The defense mounted a case centered on Lisa Montgomery's documented psychological history, arguing that her mental state at the time of the crime rendered her legally insane under the federal standard. The jury did not accept that argument. On October 22, 2007, Lisa Montgomery was convicted of federal kidnapping resulting in death. On April 4, 2008, she was sentenced to death. She was the only woman on federal death row in the United States at the time of her sentencing. She was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Carswell, Texas, where she was held for a significant portion of her time on death row, before ultimately being transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana, in the period leading up to her scheduled execution. The years Lisa Montgomery spent on death row were marked by ongoing appellate litigation focused primarily on her mental competency. Her legal team filed repeated challenges arguing that her documented psychological conditions, the complex PTSD, the dissociative disorder, the neurological damage, rendered her legally incompetent to be executed under the standard established by the Supreme Court. Those challenges were considered and ultimately rejected by the federal courts. In the final weeks of the Trump administration, the federal government moved to carry out Lisa Montgomery's execution, which had been scheduled and then rescheduled multiple times due to legal challenges and, in one instance, a COVID-19 infection that Lisa Montgomery contracted in the period immediately preceding a scheduled execution date. On January 13, 2021, Lisa Montgomery was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana. She was the first woman executed by the federal government since Bonnie Brown Heady was put to death in 1953. She was 52 years old. Victoria Jo Stinnett, the baby she cut from her mother's body, survived. She was raised by her father, Zeb Stinnett. She was 16 years old when Lisa Montgomery was executed. The documented record of Lisa Montgomery's life does not resolve cleanly into any single narrative. The forensic psychologist who evaluated her described a person so comprehensively destroyed by childhood abuse and neglect that the question of moral culpability became, for many who studied the case closely, genuinely complicated. The fact of what she did to Bobbie Jo Stinnett, a young woman who had welcomed her into her home, does not become less horrifying in light of that history. Both things exist simultaneously in the record, and the record makes no attempt to reconcile them. What it documents, without ambiguity, is the crime, the conviction, and the execution, and the survival of a girl named Victoria Jo, who entered the world in the most violent possible way, and who grew up without the mother who gave her life. If this documentary is covering cases you think more people should know about, hit subscribe before we move forward. There is a great deal more in this record still to come. The woman whose story follows Lisa Montgomery's arrived at her crime from a completely different direction, not from a history of victimhood, but from a history of ideology, organized planning, and a calculated decision to use a child as a target. Her name is Shawna Forde. And what the trial record documents about the night she walked into the Flores family home in Arizona is something that will be covered in full in the next chapter. Most of the women in this documentary arrived at violence through chaos, through fractured homes, through abuse, through psychological histories that forensic experts would later spend years trying to map and explain. Shawna Forde arrived at violence through conviction. That distinction matters, because what the trial record documents about Shawna Forde is not the story of a person who broke under pressure or snapped in a moment of psychological crisis. It is the story of a person who planned, organized, recruited, and executed a home invasion with the specific intention of murdering an entire family, including a 9-year-old girl, in order to fund a paramilitary operation she believed she was leading on behalf of the United States border. The ideology came first. The child came second. Understanding how those two things connected requires going back to the beginning of Shawna Forde's documented history. Shawna Forde was born on March 5, 1966, in Everett, Washington. Her early life, as documented in court records and investigative journalism covering her case, was marked by instability, frequent moves, and a pattern of behavior that people who knew her across multiple periods of her life described consistently as manipulative, grandiose, and detached from ordinary social boundaries. She had a criminal history before the events of 2009. Court records document convictions for theft and prostitution in Washington state in earlier years. She had children of her own, and the documented record of her relationships with them is one of significant absence and disruption. By the mid-2000s, Shawna Forde had become involved in anti-immigration activism along the United States and Mexico border. She aligned herself with the Minutemen movement, a loosely organized network of civilian groups who positioned themselves as volunteer border enforcement, monitoring stretches of the Arizona and Texas border for undocumented crossings. Shawna Forde was not a passive participant in this world. She sought leadership. She founded her own splinter organization, which she called Minutemen American Defense, and she presented herself within that community as an experienced field operative with connections to law enforcement and intelligence networks. Investigators who later examined her background found those claims to be largely or entirely fabricated. But within the circles she moved in, the self-presentation was effective enough to attract followers. By 2009, according to the trial record and the testimony of co-conspirators, Shawna Forde had developed a specific operational concept that she described to associates as a way of funding the border operation. The plan, as documented in testimony, was to identify and rob individuals believed to be involved in drug trafficking along the border. People she apparently calculated would be unlikely to report a robbery to law enforcement given the nature of their own activities. The man she identified as a target was Raul Flores. Raul Flores lived in Arivica, Arizona, a small unincorporated community roughly 11 miles north of the Mexican border. He lived there with his wife, Gina Gonzalez, and their daughter, Brazenia Flores, who was 9 years old. There were suggestions, never fully verified in the trial record, that Raul Flores had some connection to drug activity. What the trial record documents clearly is that Shawna Forde decided he was a viable target, recruited 2 men to assist her, Jason Bush and Albert Gaxiola, and planned an armed home invasion. On the night of May 30, 2009, Shawna Forde, Jason Bush, and Albert Gaxiola approached the Flores family home in Arivica. Shawna Forde and Jason Bush went to the front door. According to the testimony of Gina Gonzalez, who survived the events of that night, they presented themselves as law enforcement officers. They claimed to be pursuing a fugitive and asked to be let inside. Raul Flores opened the door. Once inside, Jason Bush shot Raul Flores. He then shot Gina Gonzalez. Gina Gonzalez survived by pretending to be dead. Brazenia Flores, 9 years old, was in the home. According to Gina Gonzalez's testimony, Brazenia did not hide. She did not run. She spoke directly to the intruders. She asked them why they had shot her father. She asked them not to hurt her. Jason Bush shot Brazenia Flores twice. She died at the scene. Gina Gonzalez, wounded and lying still, waited until the intruders left the house. She then retrieved a firearm and exchanged gunfire with Jason Bush when he briefly returned to the home. She called 911 while still injured. Her 911 call, which was played at trial, documented her account of the events in real time. It became one of the central pieces of evidence in the prosecution of all 3 defendants. The investigation moved through physical evidence, digital communications, and the testimony of multiple individuals within Shawna Forde's network who had knowledge of the planning and the aftermath. Shawna Forde was arrested in June 2009. Her trial in Pima County, Arizona began in January 2011. The prosecution presented a case built on Gina Gonzalez's eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence from the crime scene, digital communications between Forde and her co-conspirators, and the testimony of individuals who had heard Forde describe the operational plan in the weeks before the murders. The defense challenged the reliability of identification evidence and the specific role Shawna Forde played in the shootings themselves, given that the physical trigger was pulled by Jason Bush rather than Forde. The jury was not persuaded by that distinction. Under Arizona felony murder law, all participants in a murder committed during the course of a felony bear equal criminal responsibility regardless of who fired the weapon. On February 22, 2011, Shawna Forde was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Raul Flores and Brazenia Flores, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder for the shooting of Gina Gonzalez, and additional charges including aggravated assault and burglary. On March 1, 2011, she was sentenced to death on both murder counts. She was sent to the Arizona State Prison Complex at Perryville, which houses the state's female death row population, where she remains as of the time this documentary was produced. Shawna Forde's time on death row has been marked by ongoing legal activity. Her appellate team has raised challenges including claims of ineffective assistance of counsel at trial, challenges to the jury selection process, and arguments relating to the specific application of the felony murder statute to her case. Those challenges have worked through the Arizona State Appellate System and into federal habeas corpus proceedings without producing a reversal of her conviction or sentence. What the documented record of Shawna Forde's case adds to the broader picture of this documentary is something specific and worth stating directly. The other cases in this documentary involve crimes that emerged from personal histories of trauma, from psychological deterioration, from relationship dynamics that spiraled into catastrophic violence. Shawna Forde's case involves none of those mitigating textures in any significant documented form. What it involves, according to the trial record, is an adult woman who constructed an ideological framework that allowed her to classify a specific family, including their 9-year-old daughter, as acceptable targets for lethal violence in service of a cause she had appointed herself to lead. The jury that convicted her deliberated for a relatively short period before returning their verdict. Gina Gonzalez, who lost her husband and her daughter on the night of May 30, 2009, testified at trial and has spoken publicly about her experience in the years since. Brazenia Flores was 9 years old. She liked to dance. She asked the people who were about to kill her not to hurt her. The record does not leave room for ambiguity about what happened in that house, or about who planned it. Shawna Forde remains on Arizona's death row. No execution date has been set as of the time this documentary was produced. The case that follows Shawna Forde's takes us back further in time, to 1995, and to a crime committed by someone who was, at the time, younger than Brazenia Flores' killer but older than Brazenia herself. A college student in Tennessee who lured a classmate into the woods. And what she did there is documented in trial records that the presiding judge described as among the most disturbing he had reviewed in his career on the bench. The cases covered so far in this documentary involve adults. Women who had lived enough life to accumulate history, to make decisions across years, to construct the circumstances that eventually led to the worst thing they ever did. Christa Pike was 18 years old. She was a college student. And what the Knox County, Tennessee trial record documents about the night of January 12, 1995, is not a story of impulsive adolescent violence that escalated beyond anyone's expectation. It is a story of deliberate cruelty, sustained over 30 minutes, against a classmate who had done nothing to deserve what was done to her. Christa Pike holds a specific distinction in the documented history of American capital punishment. At the time of her sentencing, she was the youngest woman to be placed on death row in the United States. She was 19 years old when the jury returned its verdict. That fact sits alongside the facts of what she did in a way that the trial record makes no attempt to resolve. Christa Pike was born on March 10, 1976, in West Virginia. Her early life, as documented in the mitigation evidence compiled for her trial, was unstable. She moved frequently with her family across multiple states during her childhood. Her home environment was marked by disruption, and her educational history reflected the kind of inconsistency that frequent relocation produces in a child's development. By the mid-1990s, Christa Pike had enrolled in the Job Corps program at a center in Knoxville, Tennessee. Job Corps is a federally funded education and vocational training program designed to assist young people who have struggled in conventional educational settings. It operates residential campuses where enrolled students live and attend classes together. The Knoxville Job Corps Center was where Christa Pike met the two people whose presence in her life would define everything that followed. The first was Tatterall Shipp, who became her boyfriend. The second was Colleen Slemmer, who was also enrolled at the center. The documented record of what passed between Christa Pike and Colleen Slemmer in the period leading up to January 12, 1995, centers on romantic jealousy. Christa Pike believed, according to testimony presented at trial, that Colleen Slemmer had been or was pursuing a romantic relationship with Tatterall Shipp. Whether that belief was accurate or not is less important to the documented record than what Christa Pike decided to do about it. Testimony established that in the days before January 12, Christa Pike had spoken to others about Colleen Slemmer in terms that went beyond ordinary jealousy or social conflict. She had, according to witnesses, expressed a desire to kill her. On the night of January 12, 1995, Christa Pike, Tatterall Shipp, and a third individual named Shawna Peterson lured Colleen Slemmer away from the Job Corps campus. They told her they were going to a secluded area near the campus to smoke marijuana. Colleen Slemmer went with them. What happened in that secluded area over the next 30 minutes is documented in the forensic evidence, the pathology report, and the testimony of Shawna Peterson, who cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a lesser charge. Christa Pike and Tatterall Shipp attacked Colleen Slemmer. The attack involved beating, cutting, and what forensic evidence established was a sustained and deliberate infliction of wounds over a period of approximately 30 minutes. Colleen Slemmer was beaten with a piece of asphalt. She was cut with box cutters and other implements. The pathology report documented injuries consistent with prolonged assault rather than a single decisive act of violence. Before Colleen Slemmer died, according to testimony, Christa Pike used a piece of broken asphalt to deliver the blows that would ultimately prove fatal. She also, according to the evidence presented at trial, cut a piece of Colleen Slemmer's skull and kept it as a trophy. That detail, documented in the physical evidence recovered from Christa Pike's possession, is one that investigators and prosecutors returned to repeatedly in describing why this case warranted the sentence it received. Colleen Slemmer was 19 years old. Her body was found the following morning. The investigation moved through physical evidence, the cooperation of Shawna Peterson, and the forensic evidence that connected Christa Pike and Tatterall Shipp directly to the crime scene and to the victim. Both Christa Pike and Tatterall Shipp were arrested. Christa Pike's trial in Knox County proceeded in 1996. The prosecution built its case on Peterson's testimony, the forensic evidence, and the physical trophy recovered from Pike's possession. The defense presented arguments related to Pike's age, her developmental history, and the influence of Tatterall Shipp on her behavior. The jury convicted Christa Pike of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death. Tatterall Shipp, tried separately, was also convicted and sentenced to death, though his sentence was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment following appellate proceedings related to his age at the time of the crime. Christa Pike was sent to the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee, where the state's female death row population is housed. Her time on death row has been extensive. She has now spent more years on Tennessee's death row than almost any other inmate in the facility's documented history. If you have stayed with this documentary this far, subscribe now. The cases that follow involve patterns that the individual stories alone do not fully reveal until you see them placed together. The documented record of Christa Pike's behavior inside Riverbend is not the record of a person who arrived at prison and found a way toward rehabilitation or institutional stability. In 2001, while awaiting execution at Riverbend, Christa Pike was charged with attempting to murder a fellow death row inmate named Patricia Burks. Court records document that Pike attempted to strangle Burks with a shoelace during an interaction between the two inmates. Burks survived. Christa Pike was charged and convicted of attempted first-degree murder as a result of this incident, receiving an additional life sentence on top of her existing death sentence. The incident documented something that the broader record of Christa Pike's case had already suggested, that the violence in January 1995 was not the expression of a temporary state of mind that prison had corrected or contained. Her appellate proceedings have been extensive and have moved through both state and federal court systems over the nearly 3 decades she has spent on death row. Arguments raised in those proceedings have included challenges to the effectiveness of her trial counsel, to the jury selection process, and to the constitutionality of executing someone for a crime committed when they were 18 years old. A legal argument that has gained increasing traction in constitutional litigation across the country in the years since Pike was sentenced, though it has not produced a reversal in her specific case. Tennessee has carried out very few executions in recent decades, and the state's death row population has existed in a condition of legal and procedural uncertainty for extended periods. Christa Pike remains on death row at Riverbend as of the time this documentary was produced. No execution date has been scheduled. She has now spent more than half of her entire life on death row for a crime she committed at 18 against a classmate who had, according to every piece of documented evidence, done nothing to warrant 30 minutes of deliberate cruelty in a field outside a Job Corps campus in Knoxville, Tennessee. Colleen Slemmer was 19 years old. She had enrolled in a program designed to help young people build a future. She did not get one. The systemic truth that this documentary has been building toward across these three cases is not difficult to see once all three are placed in the same frame. What the documented psychological evaluations, the mitigation records, and the behavioral histories compiled across these cases reveal is a pattern in how the American criminal justice system encounters women who commit extreme violence. The tension between documented histories of trauma and the legal standard that holds individuals fully accountable for their actions regardless of the conditions that shape them. That tension does not resolve in any of these cases. It simply sits in the record, unreconciled, while the women it belongs to continue to exist inside institutions built to hold them until the state decides what to do next. The next case takes us to Idaho in 1992. To a house fire. To a woman who stood outside and watched while her husband and 2 children burned. And then drove to an insurance office. There is a particular kind of deception that investigators describe as among the most difficult to prosecute. Not the deception of a person who panics and lies to cover a spontaneous act of violence, but the deception of a person who has planned what they are about to do, who has arranged the financial architecture around it in advance, and who is capable of performing grief so convincingly that the people around them, including law enforcement, do not initially question what they are seeing. Robin Lee Rowe was that kind of person. And what the Idaho court record documents about the fire that killed her husband and 2 children on February 10, 1992, is not a story that begins with the fire. It begins months earlier, with insurance policies. Robin Lee Rowe was born on September 19, 1953 in the United States. The documented record of her early life does not contain the extensive trauma histories that appear in several of the other cases in this documentary. What the record documents instead is a pattern of behavior across multiple relationships and multiple years that investigators would later describe as calculated financial exploitation concealed behind the performance of ordinary domestic life. By the early 1990s, Robin Lee Rowe was living in Boise, Idaho, with her husband Mac Rowe and her 2 children, her son Joshua, who was 10 years old, and her daughter Tabitha, who was 8. Mac Rowe was Robin's second husband. In the months leading up to February 1992, Robin Lee Rowe had taken out a series of life insurance policies. The policies covered her husband and both of her children. The total value of the policies, as documented in the prosecution's financial evidence at trial, represented a significant sum, ultimately amounting to over $176,000 in collected proceeds. Investigators would later establish that the policies had been taken out in a compressed time frame in the period shortly before the fire. On the night of February 10, 1992, a fire broke out at the Rowe family home in Boise. Mac Rowe, Joshua Rowe, and Tabitha Rowe were inside the house. They did not get out. All 3 died in the fire. Robin Lee Rowe was not inside the house when it burned. The cause of the fire became the central question of the investigation that followed. Fire investigators examined the scene and determined, according to the documented findings, that the fire had been deliberately set. The investigation moved to Robin Lee Rowe. What emerged through the financial investigation was the insurance policy trail, the timing of the policies, the amounts involved, and the fact that Robin Lee Rowe had moved to collect on them in the period following the fire. She had, according to the documented record, filed insurance claims and begun the process of accessing the policy proceeds while the investigation into the fire's cause was still active. The investigation also examined Robin Lee Rowe's movements and behavior on the night of the fire. The documented evidence established that she had not been in the house when the fire started. Her explanation for her absence at the time the fire broke out was examined by investigators and found, according to court records, to be inconsistent with other documented evidence. Robin Lee Rowe was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Her trial in Ada County, Idaho proceeded in 1993. The prosecution's case rested on the arson investigation findings, the financial evidence documenting the insurance policies and their timing, and the behavioral evidence of Rowe's actions in the period before and immediately after the fire. The defense challenged the arson findings, arguing that the cause of the fire had not been established beyond reasonable doubt as deliberate, and raised questions about the sufficiency of the financial evidence as proof of premeditated murder. The jury rejected those arguments. Robin Lee Rowe was convicted on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death. She was transferred to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, where she has remained on death row since her conviction. Idaho's death row population is small, and the state has carried out very few executions in recent decades. Robin Lee Rowe has been on death row for more than 30 years as of the time this documentary was produced. Her appellate proceedings have continued across those decades, raising challenges to the arson investigation methodology, the financial evidence, and the conduct of her trial. Those challenges have not produced a reversal of her conviction or sentence. What the Robin Lee Rowe case adds to this documentary is a specific and documented category of premeditated violence that sits somewhat apart from the other cases covered here. The murders of Mac Rowe, Joshua Rowe, and Tabitha Rowe did not involve a confrontation, a weapon, or a moment of direct personal violence between Robin Lee Rowe and her victims. They involved a locked door, a fire, and a financial plan that had been assembled in the months beforehand. The victims were her own children. Joshua was 10. Tabitha was 8. The record does not document any evidence that either child had any awareness of what was being planned around them. They were, according to everything the trial record establishes, simply inside the house when it was set alight. Robin Lee Rowe remains on Idaho's death row. No execution date has been set as of the time this documentary was produced. That was the documented story of Robin Lee Rowe. But inside a completely different set of walls, in a completely different state, at almost exactly the same period in American history, another case was unfolding that involved a different kind of multi-victim violence. Not a family. Not insurance money. But a single night in Lexington, Kentucky in 1986 that left 5 people dead, including a 14-year-old boy. Her name is LaFonda Foster. And the scale of what the Kentucky court record documents about that night is something that, even placed alongside the other cases in this documentary, occupies its own particular category of documented horror. LaFonda Foster was born on October 18, 1962 in Kentucky. The documented record of her background available through court records and verified reporting does not contain the extensive forensic psychological histories that appear in some of the other cases in this documentary. What the record does document is the crime itself, one of the most numerically devastating single-night acts of violence committed by a woman in modern Kentucky criminal history. On the night of January 26, 1986, LaFonda Foster and a co-defendant named Tina Powell participated in a series of attacks in Lexington, Kentucky, that resulted in the deaths of 5 people. The victims were Carlos Mayora, age 33, Danny Wilkerson, age 27, Timothy Donahue, age 34, Manuel Resendez, age 30, and William Fiedler, age 14. William Fiedler was 14 years old. The attacks involved stabbing, beating, and in at least one instance, fire. The documented evidence established that the victims were attacked across multiple locations over the course of the same night, and that the violence was sustained and involved multiple methods. The investigation that followed gathered physical evidence and witness testimony that connected LaFonda Foster and Tina Powell to all 5 deaths. Both were arrested and charged. LaFonda Foster's trial in Fayette County, Kentucky resulted in conviction on 5 counts of murder. She was sentenced to death on each count. Tina Powell was also convicted and sentenced to death, though Powell's sentence was subsequently modified through appellate proceedings. LaFonda Foster was transferred to the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women, where Kentucky's female death row population is housed. Kentucky has maintained a moratorium on executions for an extended period, and the state's death row population exists in a condition of legal suspension that has persisted for years. LaFonda Foster's current status as of the time this documentary was produced reflects that broader moratorium. She remains on death row with no execution date scheduled, in a state that has not carried out an execution in decades. The 5 people who died on the night of January 26, 1986, in Lexington, Kentucky, ranged from a 33-year-old man to a 14-year-old boy. The documented record does not offer a clear single motive that explains the full scope of what happened that night. What it documents, without ambiguity, is the outcome. 5 people were dead before morning. And LaFonda Foster has spent nearly 4 decades on death row in a state that has not yet decided when or whether it will carry out the sentence her jury handed down. The next chapter moves to Florida, to a case that involves not a single night of violence but several days, a kidnapping that became something else, and a young woman named Heather Strong, whose documented last days form one of the most disturbing sustained crime narratives in this documentary. Every case in this documentary involves a moment of decision. A point in time where the documented record shows a person making a choice that closed off every other possibility. For some of the women covered in these chapters, that moment arrived suddenly. For Emilia Carr, the documented record shows something different. It shows a series of decisions, made across several days, that extended the suffering of another human being before ending her life. That sustained quality, the time involved, the deliberateness of each successive step, is what places the Emilia Carr case in a category that Florida prosecutors described on the record as among the most disturbing they had encountered. Emilia Carr was born on January 29, 1987 in Florida. She was 22 years old at the time of the crime that sent her to death row. Her background, as documented in court records and verified reporting, includes a history of unstable relationships and involvement in a social environment marked by dysfunction and interpersonal violence. The central relationship in the documented record of this case is between Emilia Carr and a man named James Acum. James Acum had a girlfriend named Heather Strong. Heather Strong was 21 years old. She lived in Marion County, Florida. The documented motive established at trial centered on Emilia Carr's relationship with James Acum and her desire to remove Heather Strong from that equation permanently. What followed was not impulsive. According to the trial record, Emilia Carr, James Acum, and a third individual planned and carried out the kidnapping of Heather Strong. Heather Strong was abducted and restrained. What the documented evidence establishes about the days that followed is that Heather Strong was held against her will, restrained, and subjected to sustained mistreatment over a period of time before she was killed. The cause of death established by the medical examiner was suffocation. Heather Strong's body was subsequently disposed of. The investigation that located Heather Strong's remains and connected Emilia Carr and her co-defendants to the crime moved through physical evidence, digital communications, and the testimony of individuals with knowledge of the events. Emilia Carr was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her trial in Marion County, Florida proceeded in 2011. The prosecution presented the kidnapping, the sustained restraint and mistreatment of the victim, and the suffocation as evidence of a premeditated and deliberate murder carried out over multiple days rather than in a single moment of violence. The jury convicted Emilia Carr of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death. At the time of her sentencing, she was 24 years old, making her one of the youngest women on Florida's death row. She was transferred to Lowell Correctional Institution, where Florida houses its female death row population. Her appellate proceedings have challenged multiple aspects of her conviction and sentence, including the sufficiency of the evidence and the conduct of her trial. Those challenges have not produced a reversal. Heather Strong was 21 years old. The documented record of her final days, the restraint, the sustained mistreatment, the deliberateness of what was done to her, represents something that the trial judge noted explicitly in the sentencing proceeding as a factor that placed this case at the severe end of an already severe category of crime. Emilia Carr remains on Florida's death row as of the time this documentary was produced. That was the documented story of Emilia Carr. But the final case in this documentary takes us back further, to 1986, to California and Arizona, and to a crime spree that unfolded across state lines over a period of weeks, carried out by two people who traveled together and who left 4 young women dead before it was over. Her name is Cynthia Kaufman. And what the California court record documents about her case raises questions about complicity, about the dynamics of violence within relationships, and about how the legal system assigns individual culpability when two people commit crimes together, questions that her case has never fully stopped generating. Cynthia Kaufman was born on January 19, 1962, in St. Louis, Missouri. Her early life, as documented in the mitigation evidence compiled for her trial, included a history of difficult family circumstances and a pattern of entering relationships that were marked by instability and control. By the mid-1980s, Cynthia Kaufman had become involved with a man named James Gregory Marlowe. Marlowe had a documented criminal history and a personal presentation that multiple witnesses described as dominating and psychologically controlling. The relationship between Cynthia Kaufman and James Marlowe became the operational context for a series of murders committed across California and Arizona in the fall of 1986. The victims were 4 young women. Sandra Gallagher, age 32, was killed in California in October 1986. Karina Novus, age 19, was killed in California in November 1986. Lynell Murray, age 19, was killed in California in November 1986. Pamela Simmons, age 18, was killed in Arizona in November 1986. All 4 deaths involved strangulation. The investigation that connected Cynthia Kaufman and James Marlowe to all 4 murders moved through physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic evidence recovered from crime scenes across 2 states. Both were arrested in November 1986. Cynthia Kaufman was tried in San Bernardino County, California, for the murder of Karina Novus. She was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances. She was sentenced to death, becoming the first woman on California's death row under the state's post-1977 capital punishment statute. James Marlowe was also convicted and sentenced to death. The question that Cynthia Kaufman's case has generated across decades of appellate litigation and public discussion is the question of individual agency within the context of a controlling relationship. Her legal team has consistently argued, across multiple proceedings, that her participation in the murders was shaped by the psychological dynamics of her relationship with Marlowe, that she was operating under a degree of coercion, control, and psychological domination that the jury at her original trial was not adequately equipped to weigh. The California courts have considered those arguments across decades of appellate proceedings without reversing her conviction or sentence. What the documented record cannot resolve, and does not attempt to resolve, is the precise internal experience of Cynthia Kaufman during the events of late 1986. What it documents is 4 young women who were strangled. Sandra Gallagher was 32. Karina Novus was 19. Lynell Murray was 19. Pamela Simmons was 18. Cynthia Kaufman has been on California's death row for nearly 4 decades. California has a very large death row population and has carried out very few executions in recent decades, with the state maintaining a moratorium on executions that has been in place since 2019. Cynthia Kaufman remains on death row at the California Institution for Women as of the time this documentary was produced. No execution date has been scheduled. 7 women. 7 cases. 7 death sentences handed down by juries in 7 different states across 4 decades of American criminal justice. And what the cumulative documented record of all 7 cases reveals, when you place them side by side and read across them as a single body of evidence rather than as 7 separate stories, is something that most individual case coverage never surfaces. Of the 7 women featured in this documentary, only 1 has been executed. Lisa Montgomery was put to death by the federal government in January 2021. The remaining 6 are still alive. They are still on death row. And the states holding them have, in most cases, not carried out an execution in years, in some cases in decades. What that documented pattern reveals is a specific and underreported reality about the American death penalty as it applies to women. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, women represent approximately 2% of the total death row population in the United States at any given time. Of the women sentenced to death in the modern era of American capital punishment, the period following the Supreme Court's 1976 reinstatement of the death penalty, the vast majority have never been executed. They have died of natural causes on death row, had their sentences commuted through appellate proceedings, or remain in the condition documented in this film. Alive, waiting in facilities that hold them under a sentence that the state has not yet carried out and may never carry out. The gap between the sentence and its execution, measured in decades for most of the women in this documentary, is not an accident of bureaucratic delay. It reflects a documented pattern in how capital cases involving women move through the appellate system, how states prioritize their execution dockets, and how public and political attention around capital punishment has shifted in ways that have made executions rarer across the board. What most people who follow these cases individually never see is that pattern operating across all of them simultaneously. The sentence is death. The reality, documented across case after case, is something closer to permanent suspension. A life held in institutional limbo, neither fully concluded nor ever fully released. For the victims and their families, that suspension is its own particular form of unresolved weight. For Bobby Jo Stinnett, who never got to raise the daughter cut from her body. For Brazenia Flores, who was 9 years old and asked the people about to kill her not to hurt her. For Colleen Slemmer, who spent 30 minutes in a field in Tennessee before she died. For Mac Rowe, Joshua Rowe, and Tabitha Rowe, who were inside the house when it burned. For the 5 people killed in Lexington, Kentucky, on a single night in January 1986. For Heather Strong, whose last days are documented in trial records that the judge described as deeply disturbing. For Sandra Gallagher, Karina Novus, Lynell Murray, and Pamela Simmons, who were strangled across 2 states in a span of weeks. The sentence handed down in each of these cases was meant to represent a final accounting. For most of the women in this documentary, that accounting remains, decades later, formally unresolved. The record notes that the victims' families live inside that reality. And the system that produced both the sentence and the suspension continues to operate, case by case, without a unified answer to the question its own verdicts raise. Before this documentary closes, if this kind of documented investigative coverage is what you come to this channel for, subscribe now and leave a comment below with the case you think deserves its own full episode. Lisa Montgomery strangled a pregnant woman, cut her baby from her body, and was executed by the federal government in January 2021, the first woman put to death by federal authorities in nearly 70 years. Shawna Forde, dressed as a law enforcement officer, walked into a family home in Arizona and participated in the murder of 9-year-old Brazenia Flores and her father. Christa Pike lured a classmate into a field in Tennessee at 18 years old, tortured her for 30 minutes, and has now spent more than half her entire life on death row. Robin Lee Rowe locked her husband and 2 young children inside a burning house in Idaho and filed the insurance claims while the investigation was still open. LaFonda Foster participated in the killing of 5 people across a single night in Lexington, Kentucky, including a 14-year-old boy, and has spent nearly 4 decades in a state that has not carried out an execution in decades. Emilia Carr kidnapped, restrained, and suffocated a 21-year-old woman in Florida over the course of several days and remains on death row at Lowell Correctional Institution. Cynthia Kaufman traveled across California and Arizona with a man named James Marlowe and participated in the strangulation of 4 young women, the youngest of whom was 18 years old. 7 sentences. 1 execution. 6 women still waiting. And 14 victims whose names belong in the same sentence as the women who took their lives, not as footnotes, but as the center of every case this documentary has documented. If the systemic reality behind the American death penalty is something you want to understand more fully, the documentary waiting for you next on this channel covers another set of cases that the individual headlines never fully connected. The link is on your screen now.